Hello YouTube. Today I'd like to give you a little heads up about some of these HDMI devices for the Wii and the PlayStation 2 that you may have seen on eBay or Amazon or wherever. The idea of these is that you would plug these into the multi-out in your console, plug a HDMI into there, and plug that into your HD television. And there you go, you've got good quality video from your PlayStation 2 or your Wii on your modern day HD TV. For most people this should be plug and play, but depending on what games you want to play, you may have some compatibility issues. The PlayStation 2, as we all know, is backwards compatible with PS1 games. The problem with that is most PS1 games, they output at a resolution called 240p in NTSC regions or 288p in PAL regions. Most modern televisions only accept 576i or 480p or 480i as their lowest resolution. So, in fact, there actually are two versions of these HDMI adapter. One actually converts 240p or 288p, and the other doesn't. I have the one that does convert it, but depending on your television, you may have some compatibility issues. If your television doesn't support those low resolutions through HDMI, you'll just get an error message. It'll just say unsupported format. Alright, so as I said, there are two versions of this guy. One supports 240p and 288p, and the other doesn't. If it doesn't support those resolutions, the television will just go to a blank screen and do nothing. Now, I don't have the one that doesn't support it. I have the PS2 version that does support it. However, in the case of the Wii, I actually have both versions. This white one here doesn't support those low resolutions. This is an issue if you're going to be playing certain virtual console games. Virtual Console was a service for the Wii that allowed you to download old games from the Sega Mega Drive, the Sega Master System, the Super Nintendo, the Nintendo Entertainment System, the N64, even some of the more obscure consoles like the Neo Geo and the TurboGrafx-16. Now, the problem with most of those games is that they ran out to their native resolution. They ran out 240p or 288p where we come from in Australia, and so if you tried to play them on your HDTV, depending on which device you would have, you would either switch to a blank screen and do nothing, or get an unsupported format message. And so there was a workaround for some games. You would have a component AV interlace mode, and that would basically convert certain games into 576i or 480i, depending on where you lived, and that would basically solve this issue. But not all games supported that. I know Castlevania for the N64 didn't support it. Now, there's also this Wii HDMI device. This is actually, these, I don't know who made these. These are sold by many different manufacturers. It seems to be a pretty generic device. But this one was made by a company called Lenkeng. This is the Lenkeng LKV 6000 Mini. Okay, this one, unlike the others, you might see how these things, they say Full HD, 1080p. Says it on this one too, like that. But that's actually just a false advertising. None of these devices upscale. They don't upscale. They just simply take the analog signal and convert it to digital. So if you send it 288p, you're going to get 288p if it supports it. If you send it 576i, you're going to get 576i. If you're sending it HD signal, like I know certain games in the US, a small number of them, maybe 4 or 6 of them, they supported 1080i. If you send that 1080i, it'll pass it through. These don't upscale. This one does. Okay, this one basically, as you can see, has a little button. Right, it says 720p, 1080p. This allows you to switch between 1080p and 720p. Alright, so this is the only one that actually does upscale, but the problem is this doesn't support, as is the case with most component upscalers, this doesn't support 288p or 480p at all. If you try to feed it a virtual console game that doesn't support the interlace mode, it'll just say invalid format. Okay? Now, a lot of people don't realize this, but there is a way to get around these compatibility issues. Alright, this is a SCART to HDMI upscaler. As you can see, it has an input for an analog format called SCART, which is basically a European connector. This connector was intended to carry composite video, in some cases S-video, and of course a format called RGB. This is if you're living in America, you probably have never seen this one. In Australia, this wasn't as common as it was. In Europe, it's hugely popular, hugely common. Okay, and this is a pretty good upscaler to use if you're trying to get into retro gaming and stuff, because most retro games will support RGB SCART. Basically, you would feed an RGB SCART cable into that, got your HDMI out to the television, and it'll upscale the those low resolutions to HD. There's also this device here. This is another device by Lenkeng. I forget the number of it, but basically it's the same deal, but with composite and S-video. So basically you would feed composite into there, which is horrible anyways, but you would feed composite into there, and you could feed S-video into there, and you get your upscaled image. Now, both of these devices, you'll notice that they also have a HDMI input. Right, most people don't know what that does. Most people seem to think, oh, okay, that's just to give you a HDMI input back, so you don't have to, worry about losing a HDMI input on your television. Well, there's actually two additional features that these will have. One is that they'll strip HDCP coding, which is basically the copy protection on your PS3, your PS4, your PlayStation TV. So if you're trying to record footage from the PS4 over HDMI, this will break the copy protection and allow you to record the video play. But there's another nifty feature to these. The HDMI inputs on these guys, they both support 240p and 288p. So I think you can see where this is going. So if you have one of these HDMI devices that do support those low resolutions of PS1 games or Virtual Console games, all you need to do is basically take the HDMI, plug it into there, plug the other end into the HDMI on the upscaler, and plug the upscaler's output to the TV. You're good to go. That will basically take that low resolution, take that 240p or that 288p, and upscale it to 720p or 1080p. And you don't have to worry about compatibility issues anymore. So for the most part, you'll be good to go. The only drawback will be certain games that switch between resolutions, because through HDMI, they have a significant delay when changing resolutions. If I change from, say, 576i to 288p, there'll be a blackout as it changes between the two. If you feed them through the analog inputs, it doesn't care. It just does it seamlessly. But through the HDMI input, it doesn't do it. You got, like, for example, this game here, Driver. This one uses both resolutions. It uses 288p for the actual gameplay, but for the menus and some of the cutscenes it uses 576i. So if I was to feed basically this game through the HDMI input into this guy or that guy through the HDMI, it would black out between the changes, between resolutions. If it was switching from gameplay to the menu screens or the load screens, it would basically black out momentarily. But if you feed it through the analog inputs on these guys, it doesn't matter. Now, personally, I think RGB looks best for the PlayStation 1 games and stuff, but there is a workaround for those games that switch resolutions. Sony there released one of these. This is an AV breakout cable. This was actually intended for the gun con, or for basically splitting the signal to another TV. You would plug this into the back of your PlayStation, and you would have a output here for S-video, and some outputs here for composite and your audio. And of course you could still plug in your regular AV cables or your component cables or your SCART cables or whatever. So basically the PlayStation has a way of splitting the video to 2 or even 3 televisions at the same time. So basically this would go in the back of your PlayStation. The HDMI adapter would go into there. HDMI would go into the HDMI on this guy or that guy. And so for games that switch between resolutions, take the composite or the S-video and output it into here. If you're using S-video, go into there and you'll get a good picture. Otherwise, if you're just using composite video, either this one or this one will be sufficient for that purpose. This guy doesn't support S-video through SCART, unfortunately. If I try to send an S-video through SCART, I'll either get black and white or really severe rainbow artifacted image, depending on the setup. Now there is a tip to recognize which device you may be getting. This one here, which doesn't support the low resolutions, it has a little hole. Supposedly this hole, you stick a needle in there and it switches to HD. That's crap. That's a false advertisement. It doesn't do anything. This doesn't support HD at all. It doesn't convert to HDMI. It just converts from analog to digital. This one, as you'll notice, it doesn't have a hole. I don't know if that's a sign, but basically that's a little tip. If you are unsure whether or not this will support the low resolutions of Virtual Console games, check if it has a hole in the side or not. If it doesn't have a hole, that's a safe bet. And so, that's how you get around the compatibility issues of the PS2 to HDMI and Wii to HDMI adapters. Hope this video helped you out, and happy gaming!